comment about?
Well, I want to thank and congratulate Red May, the Red May Collective, because the first time I came last year, I thought it was just an impossible feat to have an entire month of events, and to have done it a second time is just ridiculous. The third time I expect will be a general strike. What Butler calls the kind of passionate attachment to power. The classic example is, and some people in the audience are familiar with this, is the relation of an infant child to one's parents. They're an arbitrary authority that prevents you from doing everything you want, and yet they're the only source of recognition and protection, and hence you have an attachment and love. And that form, that psychoanalytic kind of dynamic, is something that Butler extends to various other social forms of power, which constitute who you are, and so you become attached to them. And so, another person who has written quite beautifully about this is Paul Gilroy, who I deal with a lot in the book as well. He says, you know, these racial categories that are produced by institutions like plantation slavery, colonization. I mean, racial categories are produced by these forms of subjugation, these forms of racist violence. And yet, claiming that racial category becomes a way of inverting this position of subjugation and trying to express an agency through it. And the paradox is then, by claiming it, you also lock yourself into it. And so, how do you get out of this trap? I mean, that's the difficult question. And part of it, I think, has to do with the kind of developing the capacity to lose one's identity, to engage in, you know, I will make a detour into queer theory. Leo Bersani speaks of, in a particular analysis, in this essay, is the rectum a grave? He talks about a dynamic of self-shattering, which he says is a possibility that comes with non-heteronormative sexuality. The shattering of the ego, a terrifying prospect which is suppressed by the relation of two egos that is typical of the heteronormative relation. But he says we have to embrace this self-shattering. And self-shattering is terrifying. And so that's the problem. We want to hold on to egos and identities, but in the end we have to develop the comfort with self-shattering, with having that experience. I think the way to develop that is by forming new forms of collective life, new ways of relating to each other. And that comes spontaneously with mass movements. Not in some uncomplicated, direct way that, you know, in a mass movement, everybody will be nice to each other. Anybody who has ever been in a mass movement knows that does not happen. Okay, but it's a question of how do you organize collectivities of people such that hanging on to that identity no longer becomes necessary. And that means a different kind of subject formation.
I've offered the comrade as a generic figure for the political relation between those on the same side. Characterized by sameness, and this figure is characterized by sameness, equality, and solidarity. What does this mean under conditions of racial capitalism, of a capitalism anchored in white supremacy? It means the active confrontation with and rejection of these conditions in a recomposition of equality and solidarity. The CP's commitment to Black self-determination in the Black Belt exemplifies this vision of comradeship. It was utopian a scandalous insistence that a large area of the southern United States belonged to African Americans because they built it, their work made it, their historic experience of capture on the ships under the lash, their re-enslavement, lynching, and Jim Crow engendered a national psychology that expressed itself as a collective longing for freedom. The Black Belt slogan refused to let this experience and this longing be subordinate to class struggle or reduced to the abolition of discrimination. The whole Jim Crow capitalist system had to come down. Black liberation, black self-determination is revolutionary, and every communist must fight for it. Further, that anyone but not everyone can be a comrade has to mean that race doesn't determine who is a comrade. This demands the elimination of racism or white chauvinism. For a while, the CP was feverishly invested in this process in ways that, quote, sometimes degenerated into fantastic accusations, and in ways that were sometimes manipulated in intra-party machinations. It also happened that the frequent and repeated accusations, trials, and expulsions gave rise to the sense that racism would never be eradicated from the party. Yet, as the philosopher Alain Badiou reminds us, justice and superego are intertwined in the subjective political process, right? They're intertwined in the active work of comradely discipline. Our expectations of ourselves and each other are high. Comrade is a term of address and carrier of expectations for action. Just as the party is a form for political struggle, so is comrade a form for relations between those who share a politics. It's not risk-free, it's not a magical solution to all the problems facing the left, but it is the only form through which these problems might be solved. Anything less dooms us to competition, individualism, cynicism, and melancholia. To be a left at all, we have to be comrades. Thanks.
The 50th anniversary of the events of 1968 provide an opportunity for us to reconsider how capital and the state's response to this crisis gave rise to the moment that we still live in, right? And that while much attention has been focused on Chile in 1973 as the origins of neoliberalism, that if we look at the response to the events of 1968 in the US, in particular, kind of counterinsurgent response to the socialist struggles in North America, we can better understand a kind of neoliberal turn in US and global capitalism. Because it was in this precise historical context where the ruling class lost its ability to be able to govern through popular legitimacy, right, through consent. And in this book called If They Come in the Morning that Angela Davis edited, do you know this book as well? I'm going to talk about a bunch of books people don't know. They argued that it was in this moment that the capitalist state became increasingly relying on coercive measures as part of what they called, following Herbert Marcuse, a kind of preventative counter-revolution against the socialist struggles of the society. And they used this concept to try to describe and explain why it was that tens of thousands of black, brown, and poor people increasingly filled the jails and prisons. They observed while tens of thousands more were under surveillance by the police, by the FBI, by military, and so on. And of course, they were pitting these interventions in the wake of Davis's own arrest and incarceration in a clear use of confinement as a counterinsurgent tactic. So in reflecting on this experience in the forward to this edition, Davis and Apteker observed that this preventative counter-revolution had arisen out of an acute and general crisis of the social order. And I argue that these words provided a kind of radical challenge to the consolidation of a more authoritarian state in the aftermath of these events. And they encouraged audiences to resist and interpret the ways in which racism was catalyzing consent to coercive resolutions of the crisis of the state at this juncture. But they also invite readers to engage in a revolutionary and democratic struggle to expose the prison system as an appendage of the capitalist state and to demand the abolition of the system in the present form, a struggle that's ongoing, right? And many of the people at this table have actively participated in for some time. So in doing so, I think they articulate a strategy for building alliances in resistance to racism, prisons, and war, and to repression in the prison system. A half century later, and in the midst of another kind of crisis, I think they point to some of the unfinished business of these kind of alliances in the present moment and suggest the possibilities for building alliances among poor, Black, brown, indigenous, queer, and trans communities, people with disabilities, migrants, working people, and order to challenge what's I would call kind of neoliberal carceral state.
What about the nature of policing itself? Can't we just fix policing with some community policing, some de-escalation training, put some body cameras on, have some implicit bias training? That's my favorite. Implicit bias training. This is the idea that people have these unconscious biases that we can measure through laboratory psychological testing, and we put people in front of monitors with little buttons, and we get these little micro-millisecond differences, and that if we could just train officers to be aware of their unconscious, unintentional bias, that this would help end the killing of unarmed Black people. But of course, as Jorge pointed out, we don't have a problem of implicit bias. We have a problem of flagrant racism. Now, this is not, so that when we look for racism in American policing, we sure find it. When we see the emails, when we get access to the chat rooms, right? When we find the white supremacist tattoos underneath the uniforms, that stuff is all out there, and there's nothing implicit about it. But this does not mean that all police officers have to be thought of as racist individuals, because that's just clearly not true. I've spent a career working with police officers, and it's just not true. And in a place like New York, a majority of police officers are non-white. In Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, but no one's holding up those police departments as models of perfect policing with no problems of racialized policing, because it's not about just the bias of an individual police officer. It's about the fundamental mission that we've given the police. Implicit bias is the perfect liberal solution to the problems of policing, because it allows politicians to say they're doing something about the race problem in a way that no one is responsible for. It was all a big misunderstanding. I know you didn't mean it. It was an accident. And could you please not kill any more Black people, and we'll all be much happier. Thank you very much. No, the problems of racism are about the mission we've given police. A totally professional, unbiased, community-driven, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin someone's life for no damn good reason. We've had a war on drugs for 40 years. Drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and of greater potency than they've ever been. The war on drugs has never had anything to do with public health or public safety. It's about a cynical, toxic politics of race, the mobilization of white fear and resentment through the lens of a moralistic crusade around drugs that just drives overdoses, death, mass criminalization. So if we want to do something about the problems of policing, we need to quit tinkering with technocratic fixes like body cameras, and we need to ask why we've turned every problem in our communities over to the police to solve, or perhaps more importantly, why we've allowed our elected officials to frame every problem in our communities as a problem that can only be solved by policing. That's the real issue.